Hi, I'm going to talk to you guys about my essay that I read called Selective Moral Disengagement and the Exercise of Moral Agency, written by Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura was always interested in psychology growing up, and so finally he earned his degree from the University of British Columbia in 1949, and then went on to graduate school at the University of Iowa. He earned his MA degree in 1951 and his PhD in clinical psychology in 1952. Albert Bandura is an influential social cognitive psychologist who is best known for his social learning theory, the concept of self-efficiency, and his famous Bobo doll experiment. Bandura has received numerous awards for his contributions to psychology, and in his later years he actually became a professor at Stanford University. He's widely regarded as one of the best psychologists. In 2002, Bandura published his Journal of Moral Education, which included the essay that I read. The essay is about tactics and strategies that individuals use to make it easier for them to be morally disengaged. Bandura uses evidence and background from big events throughout history to emphasize the dramatic effects that being morally disengaged can cause. So the first section in this essay that it talked about was mechanisms of moral disengagement. So strategies for what people to do in order to not feel bad about the wrongs that they do. So the first one was moral justification. So that's where people have to justify the morality of their actions in order to engage in the harmful activity. Then there's euphemistic labeling, which makes a harmful conduct respectable. And an example of this is saying ethnic cleansing instead of genocide. There's advantageous comparison, which is behaviors viewed in a different light because of what it is compared against. Displacement of responsibility, so the person themselves is not directly responsible for the action, they are under an authority. Diffusion of responsibility, so subdividing tasks in order to make a job seem harmless. There's disregard or distortion of consequence, which is where the individual does not want to face the thing that they are harming, so that they don't actually view the suffering. Dehumanization is stripping people of their human qualities, so there's no personal distress when causing the harm. There's attribution of blame, so believing that one is forced to do wrong because of their circumstances, and this is a big part of victim blaming. There's transformative power of progressive moral disengagement, so it's starting with mildly harmful acts and upping the levels until individuals no longer think that any harm or any task is cruel. And finally, to summarize this section, the author talked about conjoined operation of disengagement mechanisms, which is basically where individuals, they put together multiple different mechanisms to help us feel better morally. So instead of just using one mechanism, most people use multiple. So the second section is about disengagement in everyday life. It occurs regularly and is constantly around us, from powerful people to our neighbors, and it is usually at the benefit or brings a profit to the individual, even at the harm of others. So an example of this is smoking. And so even though there's a lot of evidence and studies about how smoking is so bad on our bodies, people still sell it because it brings such a profit to our government. The third and final section in this essay is about moral disengagement on developmental life courses and personal and social sanctions. So developmentally, signs start very young. So in a child, you are able to see different signs, such as they are quick to resort to aggressive behavior, they experience low guilt over injurious conduct. There's also peer modeling, so if they are around the moral disengagement, then they potentially could pick up on that and become morally disengaged themselves. And then the personal and social sanctions, that's the actions or the product of personal and social influence. So, for example, a person is more likely to steal if people around them are also stealing. The author finally concluded with human cruelty. So there was the idea of obedience versus rebellion. So more hideous crimes have been committed in the name of obedience than in the name of rebellion. And then there's also the idea of tight government with control promotes moral disengagement, while a government with diverse perspective and concerns makes it so people don't want to be morally disengaged. And So, all in all, this essay was really interesting to read about, and the main point that interested me was the use of historical moments to highlight moral disengagement, such as in the Holocaust or in the Vietnamese War, and also how each strategy can be tied into multiple different strategies. So, the example of displacement of responsibility can also be tied into diffusion of responsibility. While reading this essay, I came up with a few questions. So, one, how does one person in the same situation get sucked into moral disengagement while another individual can decide against it? Next, how does moral disengagement affect brain chemistry? And then, does moral disengagement have effects on a person long term, such as guilt? Or does a person not feel any sort of grief for their wrongdoing because of the strategies used? And throughout my reading, I came up with this connection specifically tied around the smoking aspect. So, like I said before, smoking and how it brings profit. So this kind of reminded me about what's going on currently with the coronavirus. There was a doctor, Dr. Li Wenliang, who was a Chinese doctor, and he was the first person to really discover the drastic effects of the virus on our bodies. And he tried warning other medics, but a few days later he was summoned by local authorities and told to stop making these false comments. He was threatened by these local authorities that if he wouldn't stop, he would be brought to justice. He had to sign an agreement form, and sadly, a little while later, he was diagnosed with COVID-19 and shortly died. This story reminds me a lot about what was discussed in the article because the government handled the situation very poorly, and because of the outbreak of this virus, it threatened their peace, and even though it hurts more people in the long run, it benefits the government by not having to do as much in the moment. And so if we were to think about it, the attention to the virus was very important, and it potentially could have saved a lot of people from dying and the virus from spreading if the government handled this situation differently. So some inspiration on what I want to study more, specifically tied into this essay, was after reading this article, I am now interested in how moral disengagement affects people psychologically in the long run. So being morally disengaged must have an effect on people's conscience, even to a minimal point. So how does that then take a toll on individuals? And then how this moral disengagement affects individuals psychologically. Besides that, what is the biology behind moral disengagement? What parts of the brains is used or not used when people engage in moral disengagement? Thank you.